Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. As Detroit looks back at the 1967 rebellion, it's important to also focus on the media coverage then and now. Was it fair and was it accurate? What has changed 50 years later? While the fires were still smoldering in Detroit, President Lyndon Johnson appointed an 11-member panel that was later known as the Kerner Commission to investigate the causes of the uprising. They also addressed the impact of the news media on the disturbances. Later this month, the Detroit Historical Museum is hosting a panel discussion on the Commission's recommendations for the media. Joining me now is the event organizer, Karen Hudson Samuels from the WGPR-TV Historical Society. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Stephen, for having me.
Yeah, I find this an interesting, really interesting dimension of this, and it's something that most people are not really talking that much about as we get ready to commemorate the uprising. But in general, talk about the role that the media played in 1967 and why it showed up in the Kerner Commission as one of the issues that needed to be addressed.
Well, the reason it showed up because they devoted a whole chapter in the report to media and the disorder.
Yes. And
they used the term disorder, right, and so forth throughout the report. And they came up with a series of findings and recommendations, and it had to do with the perspective from the reporters who covered the uprising or rebellion. Yeah. So they found that the accuracy of the media was dependent on a couple of variables. It was an emergency situation. They were, in some instances, relying on political officials for data. For example, in Detroit, officials said that $500 million worth of damage had been done. It was really 40 to 45 million. But they also found that the issue was really, there were issues that hadn't been addressed by the media. They didn't have African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanics. They didn't have a minority staff. Therefore, their coverage was from the perspective of a large part of their audience, which was white. But they also said, but you also have a black audience.
Right, right, and you're not
covering them.
You know, at the same time, I can think of some really important sort of milestones that happened during that coverage in terms of diverse perspectives. Susan Watson, who goes on to be a wonderful columnist for the Detroit Free Press, one of my role models in the job that I do now, is a young reporter at the Free Press at the time that the rebellion happens. And my understanding, and I wasn't around, but is that she was able to get to some spaces and some stories that a lot of the other reporters were not able to.
And the Free Press is a standout in that regard in terms of having her on staff. The Kerner Commission report said there was a great underrepresentation in the ranks of the media. And they looked across all platforms, print, radio, and TV. And they said African Americans at that time had a lot of their news was coming from radio. Right. More so than newspapers, which was kind of interesting. So, and in the aftermath of the years following the uprising, there was greater hiring. So on the 29th, at our panel, we bring together journalists and community leaders to talk about, in our first panel, which we had on May 13th, we looked at the findings. What did they say? And then this time on the 29th, we're going to, what are the recommendations? They address what the police should do in their relationship to the media, hiring, recruitment, forming relationships in the community. A lot of different things. And so we want to talk about, well, what happened? What happened?
Where are we now?
Where are we now?
What's your assessment of how much has changed in Detroit media in particular? How much better, let's say, I mean, God forbid, something like this would happen again in the city, how much better prepared would the media be to give a more accurate picture?
I might give a C-.
Yeah. It's not a very good grade.
No, well, it's barely passing. And I think there are two factors that come out in the Kerner Commission report that I would apply to your question. One is to the extent that at the time there were things rumbling in the community that the media didn't report or were unaware of. Detroit was a model city. Well, we also had other things going on that were unaddressed. People might say that today. are there things going on that are not fully addressed in the neighborhoods?
That people maybe in the media don't even understand.
Do we have relationships in the community? So that would be one factor. The other is hiring. And we know that people who appear on the air, on TV, are there to deliver and inform. They don't always make the decisions.
Sure.
Now, you are someone who has their own show, but if you're doing a news show, there are people behind the scenes.
Making the decisions about the content.
Exactly. And that coverage in terms of representation could be a lot better, although there are always new hires that come in, but it's really up to station management that sets the editorial perspective. And I think the stations do well, TV stations do well episodically in certain things, but
it's an issue that in most newsrooms have a fairly robust awareness of, I feel like, but then they come up short when the sort of action to deal with it is on the table. You know, I also wonder about how much media has itself changed over 50 years. I mean, primarily in 1967, you're talking about newspaper, radio, television. Now you have social media, you have lots of other media on the internet. If something like that were to happen now, that would really change the way it were portrayed as well.
It may and it may not. It's interesting. In the first series we did, we had an evaluation form. We asked people, how did you first hear about 1967? And what are your sources of news now, including social media, and the frequency with which you use it? So clearly, people can look at their phones and get something immediate. That was one of the challenges and issues without knowing the community to be totally reactive, without totally understanding what's going on. You're responding to an event without the full knowledge of what, and it's really, that may be similar, and people have looked at Ferguson and other things that have happened in urban areas post 1967 and looking back and saying, well, how is this still happening? Are we ready, and what was the reporting there? So there's still opportunity for improvement.
Yeah, I mean, I also imagine, though, that we would have far more, I don't know how you would say it, primary source reporting of what was actually happening, if not from institutional media, from people standing around on the street with cell phones. I mean, think of the power that has given to the discussion about killings of African Americans by police, for instance. The fact that you can be places that you couldn't be 50 years ago.
That's true. You get to see the event in real time. You get to talk to the witnesses.
Draw your own conclusions.
And draw your own conclusions. It's probably, before it's led to that episode, that event, that incident, is there coverage of what is underlining. It's like an iceberg. We see the tip of the iceberg is the incident. The unseen part.
What's the rest of it?
What is the rest of it? And that's something that needs to be reported on an ongoing basis before there's a flashpoint.
Okay. Thanks very much for being here. We look forward to the panel.
It's free admission, July 29th, Saturday from 10 to 12. I hope people can come.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.